Hello, everybody. Welcome to Exploring Reality. I got Kyle here, my friend Caleb. You guys know those two guys probably. Caleb's on here all the time. Kyle, this is the second time you've been on my channel. The first time was with a debate with Emerson Green. People who watch my stuff probably know your stuff because you and I share very similar methodologies.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so, Kyle, why don't you just unplug your stuff real quick before I introduce Joseph too?
Yeah, so my name's Kyle Allender. I run the Christian Idealism YouTube channel. Right now, my specialty is specifically in the philosophy of religion and probability theory, dealing with questions about God's existence, how probable is the existence of God, conditional on the evidence we find in the world. So that's kind of like the main area of focus right now that I'm dealing with on my channel. So yeah, just philosophy of religion stuff at the moment, because I've done philosophy of mind in the past, but I kind of moved on from that. So yeah.
Awesome. All right, Joseph, is DSS master, Dead Sea Scrolls master?
Yes, you got it right. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Joseph. I'm just a normal high schooler, but I study biblical academics a lot. So much really that Houston Christian University, they kind of got interested with me. But about philosophy, I'm not a biggest expert in it, but when it comes to New Testament scholarship, I can probably drop a few things here and there.
Cool. Awesome.
Just to say, we invited Joseph on just so that people who accuse us of indoctrinating the youth into Christianity, this is our prime example of us doing so.
We're not just indoctrinating the youth into Christianity; we're indoctrinating them into Bayesianism too. So
exactly. So.
All right, guys. So today we're responding to a video made by Rationality Rules. Kyle, you're the one that brought up this idea, so I'm super excited about this. Let me pull it up. And while I'm pulling it up, you guys have anything you want to say before we get into things, or?
I watched the video twice, and I was kind of like, I don't know, like there's a lot of things he said that I think are interesting, but at the same time, there's like a lot of rhetoric. So you gotta like,
yeah.
I was trying to like figure, okay, what's the logical, like, what's the actual like argument he's making? Just a problem evil argument.
Yeah, it's from the very beginning, it was pretty much, I would agree with all that. And I kind of, like I was saying in our pre-stream lobby, there's no theodicies actually addressed. It's typically just like countering skeptical theism, which I think none of us here even would use when it comes to the problem of evil. So
yeah, not only that, but I mean there are versions like I forgot his name, this guy named Perry Hendricks. He went on Cameron's channel talking about skeptical theism, and like his version of skeptical theism I think is way better than others. So like even if we talk about skeptical theism, like he doesn't even like go after like the better views in the literature. So
yeah,
even if we go that route, I was kind of disappointed.
Yeah, not to get into like a huge rabbit hole here, but typically what I see happening is skeptics will make like the Machian type problem of like logical problem of evil formulation. And typically what happens is people will use some sort of skeptical theist response to that with some sort of like Plantingian free will defense, right? And that's all that really needs to be used for that formulation of the problem of evil, because there's no specific problems of evil brought forth. And then you see typically a transfer from there to evidential arguments from evil, and they'll treat it as if the Christian's going to respond to that type of problem of evil the same way as they would like that Machian. That's at least my hypothesis.
I think we could give. Sorry, go ahead, finish your point.
No. Go ahead, Caleb.
No. I was just going to say, I do think that credit should be given where credit's due. That I thought the video was extremely well produced in terms of the animation and the art behind it. Like, very well done. It's not the style that he usually does, and that's very eye-catching. So I'll give him that. He put time and effort into editing it and making that. And of course, him having a British accent makes it
better. Yeah,
correct. Like if you had the same production quality but had someone with like a Southern accent do it, it would not be anywhere as good. It would.
Oh man, that's gonna get you in trouble, Caleb. Stephen Woodford, if you're watching this, please contact me because I need to learn how to make AI videos like the way you just did. I really want to learn how to do that. So, all right, let's start this video here. I'm gonna play it at 1.5 speed just to kind of go through this a little bit faster. That way we're not sitting here. And then when you guys want to pause, just tell me.
Why hello, my fellow apes. I hope you are well. As a naturalist, I'm convinced that your time as a conscious being is limited, and so I consider every minute you grant me to be of infinite value. Thank you. As not to waste said time, let's not beat around the burning bush. When one speaks of theism within our culture, they are almost always referring to capital G God. That is, the God of Abraham. Theism, then, for our purposes, is the proposition that an all-powerful and all-loving God exists, which entails that he has unlimited power and will always act as to create the greater good. Now let's define rationality. Rationality is the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic, and I think it's best conveyed through an example. Hundreds of years ago, it was rational to believe that diseases such as cholera, chlamydia, and the Black Death were caused by miasma, bad air. After all, wherever there was foul odors, such as by sewers and crowded urban slums, there were diseases. Belief in miasma was based on the best evidence of the day. It was a rational belief. Today, however, we know that these diseases are not caused by bad air. We in fact have so much evidence to the contrary that we now consider it irrational to believe the miasma theory of disease. A belief is rational, then, if and only if that belief is in accordance with the reason and evidence available to the believer. So yes, most of our beliefs are rational, but that doesn't mean that they're true. Whether something is true and whether something is rational are two different propositions. And of the beliefs we hold that are not rational, we typically maintain them because we haven't considered, much less even recognized, the absence of their evidential and logical support. Instead, we've leaned on intuition, authoritative figures, and cognitive bias. That said, there is a pretty famous other way of maintaining irrational beliefs that some even venerate, namely faith. Per Hebrews 11, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. To have faith is to believe in a proposition despite there not being sufficient
Yeah,
evidence.
you might want to stop there.
I was just going to say, I have so much to say about that, but go ahead, Kyle.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that's just not true. Like, that's not how faith is, at least traditionally understood in the Christian tradition, right? So I don't really know. I mean, he's going off of, I mean, I didn't really want to respond to this in detail. I was mainly just, when I watched this, I was just focusing on the problem of evil because it just seems like obviously false that faith is just the absence of evidence. Like, that's not how it's been historically defined. But I mean, I agree with him. Like, yeah, if your theory of the world is contradicted by the evidence, or if there's an alternative theory out there that better accounts for the evidence, then yeah, I agree. Like, it's not rational to hold to your theory, right? But I mean, he needs to show that, right? I mean, of course, he tries to present an argument from evil, and I'll go over why his formulation doesn't work. But yeah, I mean, at least when it comes to the nature of faith, I don't think he's done his due diligence, his research on how it's been defined. So I don't know if you guys have anything to say on that, but
yeah, I wasn't planning on responding to that point, and then that now is obviously when it stood out to me, and I'm trying to find something real quick. So Caleb, if you got something.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's a conflation between irrational, with an I, and irrational, right? Where one can be irrational, where they might not have a very good argument for believing in something. Maybe it is a properly basic belief. Maybe it's intuition, but it doesn't have a sufficient defeater. So you could say, I don't know that this is true. I believe it, but it's irrational, but it's not irrational. There's no good reason to not believe it, right? Whereas with other beliefs that have defeaters, and it would be irrational, it would be against reason, not just the absence of reason, but contrary to reason. So I think at worst you could define faith as irrational, but I don't think even most believers or even Hebrews 11 would define it that way. I mean, most people define faith as inferential knowledge, where you have, just as you would a person or a spouse or however, you would have someone who you trust, who who you've gotten to know, and then you trust them with future events that you don't know for certain, right? You trust that they'll be loyal, even though you can't always know. You're not always testing for it based on previous experience, right? So I think that faith is really meant to be inferences based on the knowledge that we do have, even though we don't claim to always have all the answers or to know with absolute certainty.
Yeah. So I'm just not going to get into it with this one because I can't find it in my library at the moment. But a lot of people like to proof text that Hebrews 11 verse as a way of trying to jackhammer the definition of faith to be this belief without evidence thing. But if you look at a lot of New Testament commentaries from theologians, you'll actually see the contextual data, and the word the word pistis is even used there is not trying to define faith as evidence. Belief without evidence. So that's just something I really wanted to pick at. I have a video I'm actually working on in that topic.
New Testament scholars don't define faith as that. Then why does Aaron Ross say that faith is knowing?
Aaron Ross is my favorite New Testament scholar.
Exactly. He's the only one you should ever exegete for that stuff.
All right. Let's move on.
evidence for doing so. So there's our keywords front and center. Now we can delve into the juicy parts, and we'll start with the worm in Adam's apple, the problem of evil. By virtue of God being all-powerful, we know that he can prevent evil. And by virtue of him being all-loving, we know that he wants to prevent evil. And yet,
Okay, stop.
when we stroll through
Yeah,
the
I was just
remains
gonna
of mass
say.
extinction,
So yeah, I mean, I'll get into this in a moment, but that seems to be assuming at least some kind of necessity condition, or perhaps a prevention condition, if you want to term it like that. So like that's a factor that he wants to put in there, right, when it comes to this. And it's not all clear to me that the theist has to grant that kind of factor when it comes to God's goodness, because multiplicity of ways in which God could be good and yet still not always prevent evil, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. So for those of you that watched my video on the Duhem Quine thesis, right, this is related because the Christian, well, I think all of the panelists here, we're all going to hold to the defeat condition, and that's a axiological assumption that's paired with theism that would actually generate a prediction that's not in alignment with what Stephen is saying. And so right off the bat, we kind of have an argument that he's putting forth that's not able to even get off the ground, at least within the context of our specific worldview, because we all hold to a different axiological theory. Funnily enough, I actually think that I hate this term, but I'm just going to be lazy and use it. I think the more biblical axiological theory is the defeat condition as well. I think we can actually find textual data that would more support an axiology around the defeat condition over a necessity condition as well.
Yeah.
So, and I bring that up because this video is particularly aimed at Abrahamic theism, right?
Yep. So even the content of like not just bare theism, but like Abrahamic theism, it seems like even then, at least the conditional probability of some kind of defeat condition is actually just going to be entailed from some kind of Abrahamic theism, right? Given the textual data there. So it's not all clear to me that, I mean, if Stephen wants to say that according to Abrahamic theism, God must prevent suffering, he hasn't presented any kind of exegetical argument for why that's the case.
Yep.
Right. So that's the first thing I would say. I mean, there's more that could be said there, but
there's a lot that can be said there. And I do have a video coming up on the textual data that supports this, by the way. So be on the lookout for that as well. So I just haven't seen people actually make like an exegetical argument from it. So I think that'll be really fun.
Yeah.
So just bird's eye view of there. What we're saying here is there's an axiological assumption here that Stephen is smuggling into the argument that Christians, A, don't need to hold to, but then B, probably shouldn't even be holding to given the textual data if they want to be faithful to the scriptures. So.
And witness natural disasters, predation, parasitic diseases, and other forms of suffering in the world, it appears obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that we're beset by gratuitous evil. That is, evil that does not serve any greater purpose or lead to any greater good. This poses a significant problem for all followers of this class.
Yeah.
You want me to get into my presentation?
Yeah, you can bring that up now if you want to.
Okay.
Because
he brings in the first condition he brings in is the necessity condition, and then the second one that he just mentioned there was what did he say? Can you go back a little bit?
Yeah,
just so I get this right.
He said, well, I don't know exactly what you're thinking about.
Yeah, just switch it up, and then it should be able to.
He said like gratuitous evils exist.
I didn't switch it, my bad.
No, you're good.
I'm such a boomer sometimes.
So go back. Like,
obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that we're beset by gratuitous evil. That is, evil that does not serve any greater purpose or lead to any greater good.
Greater purpose.
Okay.
So you can go back. Okay, so there's a few problems with this. So the first thing is that RR doesn't justify disconfirmation. So in order to generate a disconfirmation of theism from evil, so using the data of evil, one cannot go from a description of evil to it being a disconfirmation. Here, a disconfirmation of evil can be evils which are unjustified, right? So in this case, I'm assuming that he thinks that gratuitous evils are unjustified evil. In that case, I agree, right? But then we're just restating the term. So instead of saying gratuitous evil, we're just talking about unjustified evil, right? So in this case, we can say that he must show that the evils that we observed entail X, which in this case it entails some kind of unjustified evil, and X entails not T, which is it entails the non-existence of God. But to generate an X, or to generate a disconfirmation, or let's just say an unjustified evil, one must show there is something about evil which makes it unjustified. One cannot go from a description of some evil to it being unjustified. So I actually do lay out some factors for this. So to get from E to X, one must have a condition we call Y factors. So the first factor is that creatures receive no compensation for their suffering. Their evil is not defeated. Another condition we can say is that God will only authorize intense suffering if it is necessary for a greater good. So this is, I think, what Stephen wants to argue for, right? But even then, getting from Y to X does not necessarily get you there. Now, of course, I'm going to grant, for the sake of argument, the Z factors here. So I'm just going to assume that each of these factors, if there is Y, then you're going to have the Z factors go through. But we need to show why Y is obtained. So the important thing is not the Z factors. What's important is the Y factors, right? And Rationality Rules has not demonstrated that the evils we observe actually generate the Y factors. So going over factors again, animals suffer intensely and horrifically over the course of evolutionary history, and their evils are never compensated for. Factor number 2 is that God will only authorize evils that are necessary for a greater good. That's what Stephen at least says. But I think there are some undercutting defeaters for these factors. So the first thing is that the theist is not constrained by the necessity condition, as you said earlier, Than. And this is because you can always switch out your conditions, right?
Yep.
And the naturalist and the theist have to agree, at least on this point. If they don't agree on the conditions, then you cannot generate a probable evil. You can't say that there is unjustified suffering, right? And so we can adopt what's called the defeat condition. So God is justified in authorizing evil insofar as the evil can ultimately be defeated. So this completely does away with the second factor, right?
Yep.
So that's completely undercuts Stephen's background assumption regarding the greater good, some kind of greater good factor or necessity condition idea that he's bringing in here. And then, of course, we can, if the theist can show that the Pythusian, let's just say evolutionary suffering, because this is taken from Tim Howard's video on that, but this can apply to any evils, right? If they can show that given theism as a theory, that the evils will be defeated in their theory, then that does away with the first factor. So it does away with the first factor here, right? Because you haven't shown that these factors have actually obtained. And so if it is a necessary consequence of God's nature that he realized these actions, in other words, that he ensures that all evils are defeatable, then for the evidential argument from evil, if we find ourselves in some world W, where W contains an evil E, and the best action for God to take on behalf of E is contained in our theological story S, then the probability of S obtaining in W is logically equivalent to God's existence. Since God is numerically identical to such and such best actions, or we could say that it's just entailed from theism that God will do a best action, then any occasion where E obtains, so an evil obtains, the theological story obtains. So thus, the area S, which implies E, so the theological story which implies the evil, is equally proportionate to the areas of God's existence. Thus, the probability of T and S, so the probability of theism and the, let's just call it a theological story, is logically equivalent to theism itself. Therefore, the probability of S completely overlaps with the probability of theism. Now, of course, what some people might say is that weighted averages decrease total probability. So if we put in this equation, then you're going to, it's basically the probability of S is going to be super, super low, conditional on T. But the problem here is that there's no such a way, and this decreases total probability. An argument from weighted averages is no epistemic damage to this, given that God must always do the best action. But yeah, I mean, that's all I really have to say on that.
No,
but
I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the things I wanted to bring up. Now, for my viewers that just saw a bunch of math equations and got lost, here's the basic idea. What Stephen and what any skeptic might want to say here is, if we're going to make a theodicy to try to explain away the data of suffering, what they're going to say is that decreases the probability of our theory because we're adding another ad hoc hypothesis.
Yeah,
on top of
auxiliary
it,
assumption.
right?
Yeah.
Now, the issue with that is what Kyle just showed is how what we're doing is we're showing how theism actually entails the theodicy itself, which makes the probability of the theodicy identical to the probability of theism. In other words, it doesn't give us an evidential or probabilistic hit because the two stories, the two theories are identical to each other. Is that a good way of popularizing that, I think,
I mean,
right?
yeah, I mean, I have a logical sort of way to show this. So
There you go. Okay.
let's say we have the problem of evil, right? So T entails not Y, but we observe Y, therefore Y entails not T.
Yep.
So by simple theorem, theism is only true if and only if not Y. But if we say that S entails not Y, so our our theodicy entails not Y, thus given that the theism is only true if and only if not Y, then the probability of theism is logically equivalent to the probability of theism and the theodicy, right, which entails not Y. So evil, in this case, cannot count against theism, given that the probability of theism in S is logically equivalent to T, or theism. One must thus show, or one must give an independent reason or independent evidence against T that doesn't rely on evil. So this is the important thing.
Yep.
There must be independent. So like if you want to decrease the probability of theism, you can't use evil. You have to use some other data point, is basically what this is showing. Right. And so in that case, the probability doesn't go through. And there's no way in which, like, again, weighted averages don't work against this, just because of the fact that, like, it is just entailed from God's nature that he will do a best action. And so if a best action in a world W, where W contains an evil T, then if the best action for God to take on behalf of that evil occurring is contained in our story, so our theological story, then the probability of the theological story obtaining in that world is logically equivalent to God's existence. So that's basically why weighted averages don't work in this case. And the other thing is, Stephen hasn't shown why a theological story is improbable. So he doesn't really like give any kind of argument for why a theodicy doesn't work. He just kind of like assumes it or whatever.
Yep.
So yeah, that's all I have to say. But I can.
Caleb, you got anything to say, or are you just gonna sit there and look pretty?
Well, I am sitting here, but
you are looking pretty. You look like you've lost some weight. You look good.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do, although I want to, because we just had all that jumped, I do want to like maybe wait longer in the video and then make more comments, because I think he goes on to talk about So but I do have some comments. It won't be, I will say, will not be nearly as Bayesian and
yeah, but notice how I just want to mention before we continue that my analysis here applies to any evil that he appeals to. So it completely does away with every example he brings forward. So yeah.
I do have something.
This poses.
Oh, my bad. Go ahead.
So I remember Steve here. He said that gratuitous evil is any evil that has no purpose or cannot be defeated. Something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
That last part that can't be defeated. Well, universalism solves this entire issue because they can be defeated. I just wanted to throw that in there. That's all.
He'll address universalism later, but we can get into that.
Yeah.
A significant problem for all followers of this classical God. By maintaining that an all-powerful and all-loving God exists, theists are committed to a worldview that cannot admit of any gratuitous evil whatsoever. None. To them, every single instance of gratuitous evil must necessarily be an illusion. So when, for
so I just want to really hit there because he just made that claim that we cannot allow for gratuitous evil. And as he's defining gratuitous evil as evil that is not necessary for the greater good, but under the defeat condition, what he's saying here isn't true.
Yeah.
So,
for instance, we discuss a mass extinction in which millions of sentient beings suffer horrendous and often prolonged deaths. Rather than recognizing that, yes, gratuitous evil exists, theists have to spin a story, a theodicy, so that they can confidently declare, this must be for the best somehow. And they must do this with every single instance of gratuitous evil. This can't be stressed enough. Be it natural disasters such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and hurricanes, or human atrocities such as the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide. Theists must continue to insist that, well, I know that it doesn't look like it, but this must be for the best somehow. To really get this on the table, let's consider a few more instances.
Yeah, I was just going to say. So notice how it seems like he's conflating theodicy with skeptical theism here, because he's saying
Which
we have
is
to
ironic
generate.
because they're two distinct things. Because
Right, exactly, 'cause
skepticism is
he's-
like the opposite of a theodicy.
Because he's saying that theists have to spin a story to account for the evil, but then he goes on and doesn't give an example of that. He goes and gives an example of theists giving skeptical theist responses, which is,
Right.
this must be for the best somehow. So, like, the problem with this is he's not actually giving examples of theodicies that we're giving. And the other problem of it is that that necessity condition is smuggled in there still while we're doing this. Caleb?
Yeah, no, that's fair. And it would have been nice if he had at least addressed, and granted, I know that he's about to get into the evil God objection, but to address the more classic, defenses or theodicies like free will or soul making and stuff like that,
Yeah.
right? To see how that goes. But I would agree with you all, and I would make 3 points in terms of gratuitous evil, because I agree that I think the burden here is on the skeptic to show that it is gratuitous. And I think the best argument they can give is the seemings. Like, yes, it is true that at first glance, if the data I had was seeing a forest fire and animals being burned up in pain, right? Yeah, that would come off as gratuitous, all else being considered, if I didn't have other pieces of evidence, right? If I didn't have a full theological story. I can't say the word, sorry. that Kyle laid out,
that's
right?
just going to destroy the stream. Now they're going to make fun of it.
But when one expands, right? When one expands this to see other pieces of data, it does become more relevant. So, like, the first point would be that I do think that it's not simply ad hoc to say, well, maybe there's a greater good, maybe this leads to soul making, maybe. I think you can actually demonstrate in the majority of cases, not all of them evidently clear, but in the majority of them, you can look at plenty of sociological studies. And I've done a pretty extensive blog post on this that has a lot of citations about how, generally speaking, people do report becoming more spiritual, more religious, and more virtuous when overcome with evils, right? Like, there are studies that show that parents who have lost children, whether stillbirths or at a young age, report feeling closer to God out of it. People who there's actually a University of Copenhagen study that said people who live in places with more natural disasters are more likely to appeal to religion and to report being more religious afterwards because they're in that need of desperation, right? So I think there's quite a lot of empirical evidence that suffering in that way brings us closer to God. And that's why you do see countries with more wealth and typically more stability with less suffering overall are more secular and less religious. And so I do think those correlations are there, and it's not just me guessing, right? This is actually pretty empirically supported. Secondly, I would say that I think that it's not just that we can't really just go by seemings in terms of, well, this looks gratuitous, right? I think, and I'm assuming you all would agree with this, that it's not so much about quantities of evil, right? It's more about the categories of what would be defeasible and what would not be defeasible. So I think if you lived in a world, for example, with the evils that we observed that did not have an afterlife, that had no that everyone just, that this was it, this was the only life you have, and you suffer some, you win some. I think that would be an undefeatable evil. I think that would be very good evidence against theism if we didn't have reasons to think there was an afterlife, even though an afterlife is entailed under theism. Or I would say another one would be if everyone in the world had amnesia every 5 seconds, right? Where, God allows us to make a free choice, and after that free choice, our memories are wiped, and we have to make that choice again, memories are wiped, and it goes ad infinitum, right? Because then you wouldn't have any development. Like, yes, you'd be doing good, doing bad at random, but you wouldn't have character building, you wouldn't have moral development. And so if we lived in a world like that, where people simply couldn't really build characters, or those were lost, I think that would be an indefeasible evil, or at least it would be a problem. So those are the kinds of evils that I think would help hurt my credence in theism if we could observe them. But I think either they're evidently not true, or they'd be too hard to actually, give evidence for. And in terms of people saying that maybe an afterlife is ad hoc because we can't directly observe it, I'd say, one, it's entailed under theism, right? So it's not just throwing it out there. And two, if you do look at studies of things like near-death experiences, whether or not you actually do think those are legitimate, they're overwhelmingly positive. People overwhelmingly report having positive experiences and feeling comforted and closer to God after those. So I think that's from the empirical data that we do have, and it's not overly strong, but when we do have that, I think it's a really strong inference. It's not just a guess.
Yeah.
And that way, right? Same with suffering for animals. And the last thing I'll say, and this hammers it home for me, is that when you look at, as I have in my research that your audience will know, miracle claims that I've been looking at for like past 3 years or so, you never see this idea of people who are healed, who believe they've been healed by God, right? Who experience that glimpse of heaven. They never, from what I could see, in any case I'm aware of, ever report feeling that the suffering prior to that was gratuitous. You can have people who were in wheelchairs for 20 years, who are paralytics, who never say, God, he healed me, but I wish he would have healed me, 10 years ago. Why do you have to make it wait another decade? Like, how dare he? I should have. No, they're always grateful, and it's always part of their testimony, and they're excited to talk about that. And the fact that they went through even more suffering makes them even more triumphant and courageous that they were able to defeat it through God, right? So never do you see empirically, typically, in these cases where people feel like they have overcome it, that evil was gratuitous. They're always grateful for those situations. There are people who do sometimes deconvert and stuff out of suffering, right? And I would say that their soul making isn't complete yet, that'll continue in the afterlife if they have lost their faith through suffering. But I'm talking about people who claim that they have gotten to that point, who have experienced that kind of redemption. Overwhelmingly, that's a very positive aspect that people are grateful for and thankful for God. They're not cursing him, and they're not saying this was too much, I should have had less evil, and this was not necessary. You almost never see that in these kinds of cases. And so I think all of what I've said is pretty good empirical grounds, not just guessing, not just ad hoc speculation, but pretty good reasons for inferring pretty strongly that evils are not gratuitous, at least in the way that we observe them, and that to demonstrate otherwise is going to require more than just a seeming in that particular way.
The stronger way that you can argue for the existence of gratuitous evils too is, I think, like the way that Robert Bass has done it in the past from Inscrutable Evils. Kyle, I'm sure you're familiar with his paper there, right? The many inscrutable evils argument.
Yeah.
So the basic idea is like you can point to evils that are inscrutable. You can't maybe find something that is better, that like a better outcome because of the evil or anything like that. You can't imagine anything, and that might count as an inscrutable evil. Then Robert Bass, through a few different equations, right, like just says given 1,000 instances of inscrutable evils, there's a high probability that at least one of them is going to be gratuitous.
Why? Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, I agree that is probably like the best version of the probable evil, other than maybe Draper's arguments. But even there, it depends on a necessity condition.
Exactly.
So it's going to run into the same problems as Stephen here.
And why can't we do that with I don't want to say gratuitous goods, but unexpected goods, right? Because you could parody that and do that with miracle claims to say that under naturalism we shouldn't expect these kinds of goods, right? Given that they seemingly break natural law.
Yeah.
And if I can give you 1,000 cases of those that are insecretable towards what we know, for at least common knowledge of today, right? Maybe we could find out in the future, but as of now, they're insecretable in terms of the cause. Shouldn't at least one of those, like, are they all equally false? Shouldn't at least one of those have a good chance of being a real one? So I feel you can mirror that in the same way.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's gonna to basically cancel it out.
You guys ready to move on?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Of what appears to be gratuitous evil. Leukemia in children, forest fires that incinerate wildlife, infectious diseases such as malaria, smallpox, and HIV, birth defects that often deform and cripple an animal's capacity to survive. Then we have predators such as lions, crocodiles, and snakes that must, I repeat, must inflict untold horrors on other sentient beings to survive. These predators are designed through evolution or creation to do this. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. God gave them their weapons and ensured that they must use them on the innocent. And what about parasites such as ticks, fleas, and tapeworms, with the life cycle of some consisting of eating their host from the inside out? These teleological evils, we're told, must be for the best somehow. To believe this, I argue, is to be profoundly irrational. Having a faith this strong only serves to protect you from reason. Now, in my experience...
So yeah, I think that's where he concludes on the problem, at least now he's going against the evil God challenge. But
yeah, there's
a few things I'll say about that. First thing is that evolution itself, so the evolutionary process does not necessarily entail suffering. It's only the suffering, this is what John Schneider makes this distinction. There's a distinction between evolutionary worlds and Darwinian worlds, right? So like evolutionary world is just like a world where like things just change over time, right? It doesn't entail any that there's suffering involved or anything like that, right? So it's not like suffering is built into the evolutionary process. It's more of like a consequence conditional on the kind of world. That's where this idea of Darwinian world comes in, where, yeah, I mean, given Darwinian worlds, there is going to be suffering, right, in that case. But it's not going to be from evolution itself. It's just going to be given the kind of world, that we live in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Anything else? I mean, the same standard things that we've been saying for a while now just all apply to this. And so, I will say this: I'm pretty convinced of animal universalism, and so this is one of those instances too where I actually I think Trent Doherty's book on animal suffering addresses this fairly well. So I
And
will.
I'll just say that I think that animal suffering, I think it's a better argument than human suffering because it is a little bit more insecretable, granted. But I would say that it's hard to lump it all into one category because the suffering of like, maggots or insects is not going to be equivalent to the suffering of an ape or a deer or like a chimpanzee, right? Because most organisms, the vast majority of the organisms on Earth have very limited, if any, neurological system, right, where they can feel and express extensive pain. I mean, they have like nervous reactors that will stimulate to it, but not where it's the psychological distress, actual suffering that we would think of in the way that it's like suffering, where they're aware that they're in pain, right? This does apply to higher animals like rodents or apes and so forth that do have fairly complex nervous systems. But I think in those cases where you see animals that do have high intelligence, you also see altruism. You also see very similar traits that we see in moral human making, right? Where you have memories, you have development, you have behavior learning. And so I think you could infer, given the very similar neurological analogies, that these animals will also be able to develop morally and so forth if they're higher animals like us, right? The more similar they are to us, the more they can suffer, but that also makes it more analogous for them to be able to soul build and have an afterlife. And the more different they are than us, yes, that makes soul building less likely, but it also makes the suffering less bad because they can't really express much pain in that way. So, and Michael Murray makes a point to that as well. And Trent Doherty does defend, as Than said, animal universalism. So I think it's a combination of different things, but I do think sometimes we need to be careful just equating all suffering as if, the squishing of a cockroach is equally as suffering and evil as the butchering of a young monkey or something. So
I would just of a human.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Here can we go into the evil god?
Theists tend to fail in grasping the irrationality of play here, and so let me flip the script through the work of Stephen Law. Suppose that I believed in an all-powerful and all-evil God, which entails that he has unlimited power and will always act as to create the greater evil. And when I'm presented with something that's seemingly obviously good, such as children playing as they cultivate lifelong friendships and love, I argue that this is an illusion of good. Can't you see that God has intentionally allowed for moments of good as a way to intensify the suffering that follows? After all, if you didn't love that person before God gave them cancer, then you wouldn't have experienced the pain that you still do, even to this day. God is wise in his cruelty, don't you know? Then suppose you gave me countless other examples of seemingly obvious good, and yet I didn't budge at all. No, I confidently declare, this all might appear rather lovely, but I assure you, this must be for the worst, somehow. Technically, I would indeed be telling a consistent story here. My theodicy provides a possible account, but mere possibility doesn't imply high probability, does it? The fact...
Yeah, so I think the same issues apply here before we even get into things. He's equating skeptical theism with a theodicy again.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't think anyone that, especially not Trent, like he wouldn't argue that like, oh, this theodicy is possible.
Right.
It's like, no, he would say that, no, this theodicy is logically entailed from theism, conditional on the world we live in, right?
In fairness to when Stephen Law presents this, right, not Stephen Woodford, the tale of two Stephens, Stephen Law does give a more extensive idea of, well, he does it with skeptical theism, but he also parodies it with free will to say, oh, well, evil God gave us free will so that we may corrupt the good and we may be responsible for our own evils. But given that we have free will, evil God can't always guarantee it, right? And then he has soul breaking and soul crushing instead of soul making. So evils are meant to tear us down and make us more corrupt instead of and to get rid of our virtue. And that's what, you can't have that without the good. But I think Joseph wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I like to say something. There's literally a South Park episode where Chef went to Kyle and Kyle asked, why would God allow this? And Chef said the exact same thing Steven said here. See, he said that, oh, God allows good. Like he gives a lollipop to a child so he could take it away. Because if there's no lollipop, then the child won't cry. It just reminds me. It's the exact same thing from South Park.
Yeah, and it's certainly like an older concept, right? But I think, and we talked about this before we started, Joseph, but I think that the concept even of an evil God, I don't even know if that's coherent, because if you're going to say that one of God's omni properties is omniscience, right? Putting aside the Euthyphro dilemma and talking about where goodness comes from, if you're going to say God is all wise, right? And does wise entail that God shall always do the rational decision? And does rationality not entail perfect moral character, right? If you're going to say that evil is that when you behave immorally, that you're behaving irrationally, and that the rational man shall always do what ought to be done, right? Then it doesn't really make sense for an all-knowing God to deliberately do irrational things if he's perfectly rational, right? His desires would really need to be in accordance of that. So I'm not even sure that it would make sense to say that you could have an omniscient God who happens to be irrational and evil, unless you want to say evil can be rational, in which case I'm not sure how we would be defining evil in that point, metaethically.
Yeah. This is why, like, I think deism, besides the evil God hypothesis, even deism suffers from this. It's like, what does God exactly benefit from this? Like, what's God's motive? And this is something that the deist cannot answer at all. You know, they're just trying to cope at this point, trying to maintain this belief in God, but like also trying to mix it with naturalism. So yeah, deism just doesn't make any sense. I would not be a deist if I was not a theist. I would just be an atheist.
Yeah. So I know there's a few different responses to this. One is going to be Carlo Alvaro, who's an Italian philosopher who kind of shows the incoherence of an evil God by pointing out logical contradiction between that. For those of you who have been people have been asking me about my stage 2 video coming out, and as you can tell, like, I covered this a little bit, actually. It's 52 pages long, but I wanted to get to this part. Basically, like, this is going to be my argument for the necessity of God being good. So this is like the deductive argument. The basic idea here is that as one of motivational internalism, the basic idea here is that God is going to be motivated to pursue the good, and motivational internalism is this thesis pretty much that when we perceive something to be good, we'll be motivated to go and chase that good. God is omnipotent and omniscient, so he's going to know everything that's good, and he's going to have the power to do everything that's good. So he's not going to suffer from akrasia, which is like a weakness of the will, which is what humans tend to have. So when we perceive something as good or bad, we might have a weakness of will that gets in the way. And the basic idea here is, again, if given motivational internalism and God's omnipotence and omniscience, it actually seems to entail that he'd be omnibenevolent. So that's just another like quick response to that evil God challenge.
So basically with this, so is it, I guess one of the crucial premises is premise 3. So this idea where a kaistera is like, that's where evil comes from, right? And so because God cannot suffer from that, then it's impossible for God to be evil, basically.
Correct.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. All right, let me pull up the whole point here is there's a few different responses to this evil God challenge. And again, it actually might work if all the theists could do is be like, well, we don't know why God's allowing this, but it must be for the best somehow. I can see how the evil God challenge might work, at least on epistemic grounds, if that's what's going on. But Stephen isn't addressing the theodicies people give. He's just addressing skeptical.
Well, another thing with the evil God challenge is I think it's trying to parrot the theodicy. So like if I have a theodicy that answers evil, then you could say, well, given the evil God hypothesis, I have a theodicy that could answer good, something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's not always going to work. So, for example, like when it comes to like virtue building, like you can't say that like, oh, well, I'm going to build your character and then I'm going to give you like a worser character or something like that. Or,
well, I think they would say in fairness, I think he'd say the building of character is either an illusion or like in the long run, yes, like just like we would say if someone loses their faith and suffering, like, well, God's not done with them yet, right? You could say, well, evil God's not done with them yet. Just because they've managed to become good now doesn't mean that I can't crush them later on, maybe in the afterlife, and make it worse, right? Yeah. Or you could say that like if we lived in a world where people didn't have more like that kind of character building, you wouldn't. It's like a movie, like, you know, like a dumb slash movie where the teenagers get killed. Like no one cares if they're just these ditzy kind of throwaway characters, right? But if you really get attached to the character, if you really like fall in love with the person and then they die, it's way more tragic. So you could say, well, evil God wants to love each other so that when we do die, it's far more tragic and sad than it is if we're just like, you know, character number 5 just standing there, right? So I see where it's going with it, and you could really do an evil God for like any theistic argument besides like maybe the contingency, like fine tuning. God wanted to create agents so that he could inflict suffering, because a world in which with no conscious agents would not be an evil world. It would just be a morally neutral world, right? Or religious experience. God wants to confuse people so they'll start religious wars and crusades and so forth. And bring about more evil. Like you could find all kinds of reasons for that, but I think when you get down to the meta ethics of it, that's where it's problematic. So,
Yeah.
and if you couldn't distinguish between that, then you're just left at making it a theory that has no predictions, right? Because you can't predict God's actions based on whether he's evil or not. Then theism is not going to be very good in general, whether it's evil or good, if it can't make predictions.
Yeah.
The fact that it's possible that an evil God exists doesn't mean that it's rational to believe as much. You may find the evil God concept facetious, but make no mistake about it. This is a parody of precisely the irrationality of Abrahamic theism. The last thing I'll bring up is soteriological confusion. According to the vast majority of theists, God, in his goodness, offers salvation, and the lack of accepting this great gift is of eternal consequence. In the case of many of you listening today, a condition of salvation is conviction in a set of propositions. For example, that God as defined exists, that Jesus resurrected, or that Gabriel spoke to Muhammad. Hence, if I die as I am now, a non-believer, I face at best annihilation, and at worst, eternal torment. Yes, some theists believe that eventually all will go to heaven. But this belief, universalism, is today as it has always been, a fringe view that requires such a vague interpretation of scripture as to give the idea that God doesn't ordain slavery.
Did you want to respond to that, Caleb?
This
Yeah, I
threat
like
of
to
eternal torment
respond.
is terrifying enough.
Yeah, so I'm not a universalist, but I think I'm the only one that's not a universalist on this panel. So you guys go ahead.
Where it's 2-2 in terms of universalism and not.
Oh,
Wait, you're not a universalist, Caleb?
No, I am. Kyle isn't, I don't think.
No, Kyle is. He said he was.
Kyle, are you
Right?
universalist? You weren't. I thought you said
No.
you were to that.
No, I am.
You are? I thought.
Yeah, I am, but yeah, if people want to ask my specific views, they could email me.
Because you've made
I'm not-
posts recently about given that so many people.
I didn't want to make it public.
okay.
Sorry.
Okay,
but-
whatever. Go ahead and make your
Whatever.
point, Joe.
didn't mean to do that.
Yes, I'm a universalist, but yeah, my specific views.
We'll
People
just
want to
cut
know
this out.
my specific views, and they can just ask me. That's
Okay.
all I'll say. Yeah.
So,
All right.
so yeah, I honestly, okay, so the first thing that I want to just say is that I don't actually find this to be that big of a deal. Mainly just because Stephen is treating universalism as if it's like the only thing that can actually take care of this topic, when I think that's not the case. I don't think you need to be a universalist to answer this topic. But I do want to give the universalist a chance to answer the hand waving that Stephen has given here.
Yeah, so I don't think Stephen has done any sort of research, at least on the history of the church, in regards to the universalist stuff, because there have been a lot of Christians throughout history that have held to universalism. It's just that they have to keep quiet because there's been some bishops that have tried to shun the view out. So it's not necessarily that universalism is a fringe view. It only seems that way because of the way that certain universalists have been treated by the church. So that's what I'll say on that point. But yeah.
Joseph, you can go.
Okay, yeah. So there's a few things I like to say, maybe two or so. He says that okay, universalism is fringe. I don't know why he has to mention that. Okay, it's he's just trying to throw dirt into the universalist position's face, and who cares if it's fringe? Fringe doesn't mean it's false. So yeah. Second off, Abrahamic theism is not different from normal theism, just in philosophy in general. I think it's basically the same, really. That's just my opinion. And also, vague interpretation of scripture. Okay, I like reading the Bible a lot. The thing about it is this. Even if there were passages, like the best passage that I know is in Matthew 26 or Matthew 24.
Matthew 25.
Matthew 25. There we go. That passage. You have to realize that New Testament is a Second Temple. Is a series of Second Temple documents. Some of it may be post-temple, like the pastoral epistles. Who cares about that part? But we have to realize that, you have to look into scholarship into this. It's not because here's the thing about Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Jews' consensus was that there's this there was this eternal torment hell. You can see this in First Enoch, for an example. The reason why was because during the Maccabean revolt and a little bit before that, Jews started thinking about their own metaphysics a lot, and they're going okay, how does God solve this problem of evil? They were even questioning about that back then. So they decided, okay, eternal hell. That's the solution to this. And my position is that the Gospel of Matthew is itself a community document similar to the Johannine Gospel. And so I believe that the Gospel of Matthew itself is like a massive scroll that contains teachings of Jesus, but also can contain Matthean community thinking, similar to the Johannine Gospel, where we see additions to it spliced in later on, such as John chapters 15 and 17, or the epilogue, John chapter 21, or the prologue, the poem from John chapter 1 about the Logos. So my view is that the Gospel of Matthew is like a community document. And this idea of Jesus saying that there is an eternal hell, I believe, okay, if we cannot get around that, I could still dissolve it, because I can just say that this was just added into Jesus' mouth. And that's completely fine. This was commonly did in the Second Temple era. I mean, this is not a big deal at all, I believe. If anybody has any objections, I guess.
And I don't think textually, by the way, that's inconsistent, right? Because you can, I mean, the original view that I used to take was that if you look at Paul and the other places, right, in the Gospels, the idea of being born again, right, of being redeemed, there's so much language about dying to your old self and being made new, right? So the idea of destruction or eternal death, and the idea that, yes, your old self is dead and will stay dead forever, right? But that out of that, the new rehabilitated, reformed person who comes out of that is reformed. I think that's perfectly possible. Although, and one can even take more metaphysically interesting views like Alvin Plantinga, where he says that you can have both an eternal hell and also universalism by having basically hell is a revolving door where it's cyclical, where people will go into hell, will be redeemed, come out. God will always be creating new things. And so those people coming in, there's always at some point a rotating idea. No one person will spend eternity in hell, but there'll always be a cycle of people going in and out of hell. But everyone who goes into that will still be redeemed and so forth. And so you could even have that where it's eternal. I think that actually eternal regeneration is entailed under theism if God wants to create more valuable affairs. Because why would it be the case that God, after saving everyone, would stop there? Why not continue to create more good states of affairs? Why not do this ad infinitum for all of eternity, right? At least potentially infinite. So there's that. I will give him credit, however, to say all that, although I don't think that soteriological confusion is very good depending on the model of hell that you're proposing, I do think one could make an argument that, because the universalists will still say that it's a good that people know the gospel and convert to Christianity while on earth, right? I don't know of any universalists who would deny that there are goods on this earth. And so I guess you could say that by God waiting for so long to have Jesus come down, and by people taking so long to get the gospel message out there, you could say that God is depriving those people of goods. Maybe not they'll go to hell for, but that those people would have been better off knowing the gospel, and God could have done this in a number of ways by appearing to, the Mayans or something, right? To share this with them so that they have those goods, and that the fact that they don't get those goods in this life, while not, indefeasible, is still something that ought not to have happened given God's omnipotence. So I think if he was going to go down that route, he could have phrased it in that way. I think that would be a little bit more persuasive. I don't think it would be, conclusive, but that's how I would probably try to steelman that if I were to take that approach.
Yeah. And there's, go ahead, Kyle.
I was going to say, so I think one of the core issues here is the word, what does eternity mean in the New Testament?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
And I think that, I'm not going to blame Stephen for this, but like people have sort of impose their own modern views on what that word means, right? And then they've extrapolated that to the New Testament, right? So when we say something is eternal, which typically means that it's endless, it's never ending. But that's not necessarily how the term has always been used. So for example, there's this idea of Kairos time, which is where instead of it referring to an actual like preset infinite timeline or set of events, you have an indeterminate timeline. So when we say that something is eternal in the Kairos sense rather than the Chronos sense, we say that this event's going to happen and there's no set time for when it's going to end. Basically, it's indeterminate, but that doesn't necessarily entail by itself that it's unending. Right? So what does that mean? Well, let's say if I say like, okay, you're going to be put in jail for an indeterminate amount of time. That doesn't mean you're going to be put in jail forever. It just means that there is this unknown timeline that you're going to be in jail for. So I think when the New Testament uses the word eternity, it's referring to this eternity in the Kairos sense, which entails that it's conditional. So what does that mean? It means that it can last forever, but it's going to be conditional upon the choices of creatures.
Yeah,
So,
you have to be careful on that, Kyle, though, because you don't want to say that, like, when it says shall not perish but have eternal life, you don't take that to mean
well,
age means.
here's the thing.
Right?
So when it comes to that problem, I think the best solution to that is just to point out that, yeah, these people will have eternal life because no one, at least as a Catholic, I would say that no one with the beatific vision can reject God. And so that kind of like fixes their will in a way. But then when it comes to hell, because they haven't had the beatific vision, they can always change their mind, if that makes sense. So it's there in both senses. It's in both the eternal life and the eternal damnation part. They're both conditional on what happens. So they're both conditional on the choices of creatures. And so you can grant, like, hey, people in heaven will stay in heaven forever, and then people in hell, as long as they change their mind, so as long as they repent, then they can basically get out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's my same exact view as well. Like, just one last thing to sum it up.
Yeah.
How can somebody believe in eternal hell and believe in universalism? The answer is simple. You will remain in hell as long as you are there until you accept God or Christ, or I believe the ultimate good. And then after that, you will slowly get out of hell and you'll eventually land up in heaven. So that's my view. It will
Which
remain
wouldn't be eternal, though, right?
Say what?
So,
yeah, in case it wouldn't be eternal. So that you wouldn't say it'd be eternal hell at that point. It would just be
Okay,
hell.
guys.
yeah, we're getting way off track here.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's all good.
Let's focus on
Let's focus on
hiddenness
soteriological confusion here, because
Mhm.
like I wanted to give you guys the chance to kind of just back up the universalism stuff here,
Yeah, you're good.
and see past that rhetoric. But
Do you think the point that I brought up was better, though? Not the universal, but about the soteriological confusion. That would be a better argument to make, because you could entail, given that universalism there, that's not a huge issue, but the idea that those who don't hear the gospel, even if they don't go to hell, or even if it's not eternal hell, they are missing out on some goods that they ought to have had, that people ought to have shared with them. I'm assuming that you're wanting them to convert in this life, right?
Yeah.
And yeah.
So,
And
there's a few things there, right? One is just going to be that I see that as an instance of defeasible evil or a lack or hiddenness, right? I think there's a guy who wrote a book, Postmortem Opportunity, who gives exegetical arguments and philosophical arguments for postmortem opportunity. And so people that might not be epistemically or morally culpable for their non-belief, right, in the gospel, will have an opportunity to still give themselves to Christ. That's one thing that can be taken into account here.
Right.
The other thing I think is just, I don't see how this is actually, at least for me, I just don't find it as that probative of a thing, because I don't see how somebody might say something like, well, this is really unexpected on the condition that Christianity is true, right? It seems actually like the Christian story itself predicts the fact that there's going to be, especially if you take things into consideration like the divine council worldview, right?
Right.
That there's going to be other soteriological motifs out there that go against what Yahweh, the Abrahamic God, has put forth.
I mean, I guess Stephen could say, because I had this conversation that day with an atheist, is like, why not have Jesus or like Jesus become incarnate in different cultures, like in Native America and so forth, and kind of restart it there, and so you could have different cultures getting the idea or the good, or why not like teleport believers as missionaries to their, immediately after the resurrection? Why not? Why wait 1,500 years, right?
And
like that, that's kind of the more so the idea.
Yeah, and like just right off the cuff, I think my two responses there would be, one, we have a lot of testimonies of people in other countries, some that have never even heard of the word Jesus before, having dreams and visions, or of Jesus himself, or either missionaries that they weren't into. They had no clue who these people were. And you and I have talked about this before.
Yeah.
But the other side of the coin is just, I think to me, it seems like a much more valuable state of affairs to have a great commission versus a God who just sends the gospel to everybody himself.
It's participation, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I think that participation with God is a much more valuable thing than just a simple thing. The other thing is, and this is kind of Dustin Crumit's answer, like part of Dustin Crumit's theodicy to problem of divine hiddenness, but it's just the whole like alethic values of things too, right? If it wasn't for soteriological confusion, if it wasn't for other faiths, then we wouldn't have the ability or the goods of rational discourse, trying to go through the evidence, discovering things, and going into a deeper like conversation with non-believers or Muslims and stuff like that.
You wouldn't have apologetics either. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd be stuck. I wouldn't be stuck in my $1 billion apologetics industry.
Yeah, exactly. You'd be out of a job because everyone know it. Yeah.
So there's a lot of really fun theodical stories here that you can kind of go to, and I just don't find this one that probative.
But it gets worse. Most Christians, let alone Muslims and Jews, can't even agree on what's necessary for salvation, and their disagreements are only growing every year. Hence, most theists agree that salvation is necessary to avoid eternal catastrophe, and yet they do not agree on what's necessary to avoid it. Tying these threads alone yields a story of ludicrous contradiction. Despite being told that the mind of God is inconceivable to us mere mortals, we do apparently...
So I would like to see the stats on disagreement amongst Christians, at least, on what's necessary for salvation.
Yeah, I know. You know, it would be nice if we had like groups of people who made creeds that we could all agree to, and that people would recite it. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, I think we do. In terms
of really
stuff that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Yeah, that most Christians would agree to, right? In terms of soteriology, yes, there's secondary and tertiary issues, right? In terms of that. And I'm a little confused as to well, I know why he does it, but in terms of bringing up like other faiths, like Muslims and so forth, that have different ideas of soteriology, I don't disagree with that, but I'm not arguing that like God is endorsing their view of soteriology. Like the whole point of Christianity is that Jesus came down incarnate, vindicated his message through miracles, right? And said, this is the way, I am the way, the truth, and life. This is the correct way. The other ways are wrong, and you'll have false messiahs, but don't listen to them. I'm the real one, right? That's kind of the whole point. I don't think that God is giving equal validation to other faiths. I think that they're wrong, right? And we could talk about that in terms of resurrection or miracles and so forth, or incarnation. But I just don't think that God, like, I just don't buy the narrative that God is just like letting them be confused and not attempting to do it. I think that that's the whole point.
That's exactly what I was going to kind of go into here as well. It almost seems like there's actually a conflation here, because once you start talking about Judaism and Islam, you're not really within the realm of soteriological confusion of Christianity anymore. You're just pretty much making an appeal, like a different argument, right, of religious diversity. And so I think what you said there is the evident, like a really easy thing that we can do is just point to the evidence. And I think that the evidence strongly confirms Christianity over Judaism or Islam.
Well,
if we want to compare the miracles of Jesus and the message of Jesus or the character of Jesus to Muhammad, I'll take that any day.
Another thing too I want to mention, I mean, this might not be the best response, but like if we conditionalize the evidence, so soteriological confusion, on Abrahamic theism, I'm not really sure where the disconfirmation comes in, just given the fact that like a lot of the scriptures do confirm, like, hey, especially like, given the divine council viewpoint, it's like, yeah, the scriptures literally say that like people will go to like false gods and stuff and false,
rebelled Elohim.
Yeah, so it's like, what exactly, like, that's already acknowledged that occurred. So like, where's the disconfirmation?
Right. But it also does say that there will be like that it won't be so confused. Although there's confusion, it won't be so confusing as to where there's no symmetry break where you cannot tell, right? The whole point is like, yes, Pharaoh's magicians can turn their staffs into snakes like Aaron, but Aaron's snake eats theirs.
But I'm just saying. Yeah.
But I think that is the world that we live in, Caleb. Right? What you're saying is like there are symmetry breakers, and that's my like appeal to the evidence.
Yes, that's my point. Is when the Egyptians like see the miracles of the Exodus and all the plagues, like that was God trouncing on their idols, saying, "Yeah, I'm the real one. Listen to me, fear me." Yeah, exactly.
But I'm just saying,
it's not like they're all of equal merit, right? That's the point. If they were all equally legitimate or had equal evidence, then you couldn't. I think that would be a stronger argument, but I don't think that they are.
Well, Caleb, I'm just saying, even without a theodicy, just like conditional on Abrahamic theism, I'm not really sure how much disconfirmation this actually has in the first place. So that was just my main point.
Well, I agree with that. I'm just saying that even if like granting that, I don't think that I don't think even the reasons he's giving are necessarily valid either for those reasons.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're saying even if we granted that, it wouldn't be. But yeah, I'm saying I
Yeah.
don't think we have to grant that.
Know that he acts for the greater good, and that this all-powerful, all-loving, unembodied mind has created a hoop for us to jump through. A hoop that, in his mysterious ways, he's made to appear
comes
very
the
unlikely
skeptical
to exist
theism.
at all. And of those that are nevertheless convinced of the hoop's existence, they don't agree on what it looks like, what it's made of, or where it's located. And of course, for those of us so made as not to see the hoop, instead being perplexed by the millions arguing for their favored contradiction, we'll be eternally forsaken. Which, altogether now, must be for the best somehow. I propose that this is the most absurd, ridiculous.
So I just really want to point out again, right? Like, I think he's taking soteriological disagreement amongst Christians and expanding it further and bigger than the problem actually might be. Because it'd be nice if you presented some data. I think that would be the big thing, and then I think he's conflating a few different things. But a lot of the stuff that we just talked about applies to what he just said again.
Yeah,
So,
and we've talked about this, but I think most
Irrational-
of us on. Sorry, I didn't want to. I didn't mean
no,
to.
you're good.
Most of us on this panel, I mean, we have a Catholic on here and other ones non-denominational, but like we're all very inclusive. Like not, I mean, including other like salvation for other religions, but most denominations of Christianity, right? Like we have friends who are Jehovah's Witnesses. We have friends who are pretty much almost every denomination you can think of, right? And we don't do that. And I know fans talked about having conversations with people who are like shocked that he's just so okay with like even though he's not Catholic, but like he's not going to decry Orthodox or Catholics as like not real Christians, right? So
I'm super sympathetic to Catholicism and Orthodoxy.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I think that people do pick on those differences more so than they really need to. And
yeah, I'm not going to start a rabbit hole here either, but I was that your parrot, Kyle?
No, that's my brother.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that some of the soteriological disagreement too can also be like explained by psychology as well, rather than like scripture. And what I mean by that is typically, especially with like new converts, there tends to be like more dogmatism within their denominational beliefs, and to be more exclusivist because of certain psychological aspects. I don't have the data to present on that because I didn't prepare that. But there is something to be explained there as well. But and again, I don't really think that we need to explain the data too much because I think there's, like you said, Kyle, there's not really much disconfirmation here. So
Rational tale ever sold, and it's bought with emotional currency, not rationality. Thanks.
and the last thing there is just I don't think it's bought with emotional currency.
Well, yeah, I mean, if he's gonna say, I mean, if he does a response that says like, "Oh, you're making theism unfalsifiable," I mean, we've already.
That's my do him coin video.
Yeah.
It will be
Yeah.
fine there, right? I'll just point to that. Yeah, and so like I will say this. I don't necessarily see something wrong with the fact that many Christians might convert or come to Christ because of emotional reasons. So long as there are like those, so long as there's not countervailing reasons to leave the faith that they themselves have come face to face to, that they don't have like intellectual reasons for. Like, in other words, I know people that came to Christ because they find like aesthetic value in Christ, and they think something this beautiful must be like evidence that it's true. I don't necessarily see something wrong with that, so long as they don't have countervailing reasons against their belief, if that makes sense. Now, what I'm not saying, right, is that, oh, well, the beauty of Christianity and the emotional like influx that you might have by becoming a Christian is a reason to reject all the stuff that Stephen's saying. All I'm saying is that before you examine the evidence of evil, soteriological confusion, all that stuff, there's nothing really wrong with being a Christian for the emotional reasons. And I actually will say one more thing, and I think if Apologetics Squared ever sees this, he'll love this, because I mean I talk about this all the time. Skeptics really love to point out to about like the emotional bias of Christianity and Christians, right? Like somebody might say like, well, you're a Christian because it like gives you existential fulfillment or anything like that. But I actually think that's evidence for Christianity, because given Christianity, you would expect that if somebody decides to give their life to Christ, they're going to experience existential fulfillment, right? So it's just interesting that skeptics will often like try to point.
Wouldn't that be worse if they didn't? Like,
yeah, exactly. Right.
Like, I feel like that would actually be almost like it's almost the meager moral fruits argument. Like if people didn't have a change or didn't have fulfillment and felt empty inside, there wasn't a difference between Christian and non-Christian. I don't see how that would be predict. I think it would make it worse. Like that would
Yeah.
only be an indicator of like the meager moral fruits, right? Like the idea that there are people who genuinely get fulfillment out of it and happiness and peace is expected and kind of necessitated. I'd be kind of concerned if it wasn't.
Yeah. And so I just really wanted to stress that because I think that's just something I constantly hear. It's people think like, oh, it's just all emotional stuff. But
Right.
Steven, I feel like knows better than that.
Well, Stevens is smart. I mean, I don't think we should decry
I
that.
just think that's rhetoric.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, he's a smart guy. He's done debates, right? Like I do have respect for him, and I think he's a very nice person. But yeah, I just do disagree with that. One other thing, and I hate to go back to this because this is like going back to the gratuitous evil thing because it just came to my mind, but I wanted to say it before I forget. Is that I think when we're trying to deal with our intuitions and seemings, right? We have to be careful, and even the skeptic grants that because they would say when most people look up at the stars or the trees and say, "Well, it must be designed; it's so beautiful." And the skeptic says, well, hold on, we can't just go off of that. We have to look for defeaters and so forth. The same strategy basically is being done with, well, I mean, if we're saying look at the trees, the skeptic's saying, well, look at the blood. I mean, it's essentially the same thing, but my intuition say that it probably isn't. But all I want to say to that is that when you look at most people in the world who do hold to theism or something like a theism and also do hold to evil, most people don't, and I'm not trying to do an ad populum here. I'm not saying it therefore makes it right, but the intuitions of most humans historically and presently is not that evil, either that evil is not gratuitous or at least the evil is not incompatible with God, right? And granted, I know that's going to be different depending on the religion, but the fact that that's a very common intuition that most people have where they interpret evil as purposeful in some way, whether it's the Buddhist who thinks that evil contributes to reincarnation, right? Or the Christian who thinks it contributes to heaven. Most cultures, most people have intuitions that say, no, evil does build us up and does make us stronger and does draw us closer to God or the afterlife, whatever that particular religion is in some way. And so I think we're on very shaky ground to try to say that we can appeal to intuitions that say that it's obvious. It's just obvious that evil is gratuitous. Like, is it obvious to most people? I don't know if that's even true.
Yeah. Yeah. You guys have anything else to add before we start getting to questions?
I like to say that I don't really believe in Christianity because of emotions. That's just me. So if anybody says that every single Christian believes in it because of emotions, not really.
I don't think that's what Steven's saying, but
no, yeah. I just think that I think what he's saying is that Christianity is just sold through emotional means, not intellectual means.
And that's just almost the equivalent of the Christians saying atheists just want to sin. And they don't want to
God. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. They know God exists and they just want to resist him. Like
the funny thing is, again, I think I would largely agree. Like if you look at the percentage of Christians, I think a huge chunk of them might have some sort of emotional reasons for coming to Christ. But again, I don't think that's an issue so long as those emotional reasons are accompanied by intellectual reasons, which we do have. Like, Joseph, I might push back on you a little bit because unless I misunderstood you, because typically, if you look at psychology, right, our belief forming mechanisms are not purely intellectual. There are always going to be intellectual reasons why. There's going to be emotional contributing factors, cultural contributing factors, and community contributing factors to belief forming faculties. So just to act like this is purely an intellectual thing, I don't think that's the case for human. I just don't think humans operate like that unless you just don't have emotions.
I do have emotions. Well, I guess what I meant to say is that I didn't convert because I felt the Spirit. I guess that's
totally fine. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
That helps a lot. So real quick, I just want to highlight and say thanks to people for super chats. So Nick's Highlander, thanks for the $2 there, and he also likes seeing Kyle, so that's sick because Kyle's my homie. Thank you, NA Odessa, for the $15 super chats. And then Nick also just points out the reasons why people leave the church are usually due to emotions, which is really interesting too, because I think it seems to be like a counterintuitive point to what Steven's trying to say there. So, all right. So Let Me Explain asks, are there any good books on this topic? Because the video was quite out of my wheelhouse. So I'm assuming the stuff that was out of your wheelhouse was
My presentation.
the Bayesian stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kyle, you're in the middle of a series on this methodology stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I would start with his videos because I think he does a really good job of laying it out. My role in our like group of apologists is the popularizer and the translator. So if you watch through Kyle's series on our methodology and you're still kind of a little lost, just email me through the website and we can set up a time to chat. There aren't many books that highlight this stuff. It's mainly like philosophy of science stuff that you probably learn from papers. There are books out there, but they're textbooks, unless Kyle, you know of anything.
So I have a whole folder on Bayesian epistemology. Like, probably I've read like so much literature on it that it's like hard to keep up. But I would start off with Michael Streven's work. So he has like a 2-volume set on Bayesian epistemology. If you want more like intro stuff, I would recommend Niven Clemhanga's website. He has like certain handouts. He goes over like just basic theorems and stuff.
Yeah, and I would say that
yeah.
anything. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Anything by Marilyn McCord Adams or Eleanor Stump is also really good in this way. If you want like pop level stuff, I mentioned the blog article I wrote earlier. Not that I like citing my own stuff about just kind of, that's a short version. If you want like empiricism tied with soul making theodicies, and then I do have a book that I did back in 2021, a pop level book called "Searching for a Solution to Suffering" on Amazon. And if you I can also send you a free PDF as well if you don't want to pay for it.
Yeah.
But that's a fairly pop level introduction book. That's not anywhere near as complicated as what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, I will. Sorry, I started laughing, Caleb, because for some reason you said citing myself, and then I thought about the time that you were on Cameron's channel, and he for some reason put Dr. Caleb Jackson on there.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have unfortunately, those 2 degrees are.
I just thought that was really funny. The other thing I'll add in there is it's not as pop level, but I consider Trent Doherty's book on the animal suffering a must read, and I do think that if you're familiar with my content, you'll be able to work through Trent's book. You just probably, if you're like struggling to get through some of this stuff, you'll just have to reread it a few times. If you reread a few chapters, and that's totally okay. But I consider that a must read, and I think that'll really change the way you can like conceptualize the structure of reasoning. To the problem of evil.
Another thing about Trent's book. So when I first read Trent's book, I was like, where's the theodicy? Like, this doesn't solve anything.
Yeah.
But then as I learned probability theory and how he sort of calculates probabilities based on that, and when I read closely, especially like the first few chapters, so like the first half of the book, that was when I really like understood, okay, this is where he's coming from. So you gotta read between the lines. Basically, you gotta be like read word for word and understand what exactly he's getting at. So
and the last thing I'll add in here is one of my newer projects on the problem of evil that I've been trying to focus on is meaning making in the midst of suffering. Now that might not necessarily like deal as much with the evidential problem of evil, but the existential problem of evil. And so if you're interested in that side of things, I actually gave a talk to a group of high schoolers on this. And a lot of people, surprisingly, who are like even like people that are really philosophically inclined and up to date with the literature, said they actually got a lot out of it. So you should check out that video too, because I think you might get some nice stuff out of there as well. Okay. Next, we got, what exactly do you mean when you say that it is not bad for people to become Christian for emotional reasons? Does that mean that emotion is sufficient for reasonable belief? Yeah, so what I'm not saying that emotion itself is sufficient for reasonable belief. What I'm saying is that it's not a negative aspect of belief forming faculties, right? I think oftentimes people make a distinction between emotion and reason. But the thing is, I think that our emotions can have truth value to them. Josh Rasmussen actually talked about this. I forgot where he did this, but the basic idea is like there's propositional content within our emotions. Right. So like if I have like the emotion that it was mean that Caleb called me ugly, right? All right. If I'm sad because he did that, like there is some truth value to that sadness that I'm having, and that stems from some sort of like intellectual basis. So I think that if somebody comes to Christ because they had an emotional experience with Christ or with some worship or anything like that, like there is going to be some sort of like intellectual grounds for coming to faith because of that. And if you want to know more about that, I actually have a stream coming up with an epistemologist that we're actually going to talk about that in a few weeks. So yeah, anybody else have anything to add on that? Or cool. Okay. If someone came to believe for emotional reasons, that doesn't undermine the belief itself being rational, and logical arguments might not compel belief initially, but they definitely help sustain it. I thought that was a question, but yes, thank you, N.A. Odessa. Okay, Perspective says that may be true, but the evidence for religion in general is extremely weak, and I don't believe there's a strong intellectual basis to theism in most cases. And that's so. My response to that would just be that I think you're wrong. Right? You respectfully, like I think we have to be careful and try not to foot stomp about our positions here. Kyle, Caleb, and Joseph and I will be putting our arguments for why we think Christianity or theism is true, and sitting there and calling it weak is not really an objection to it. You need to tell us why it's weak or anything like that. And typically these come down to, and Kyle, I think you'll appreciate this, methodological or epistemological issues rather than the evidential issues. Anything else? Anybody have anything to say to that? Okay. Nick Stroligo says, what are some good books for understanding everything about metaphysics? The vast majority of my knowledge about metaphysics comes from me reading about different things, to be honest with you. Like, if you want to understand more about metaphysics, like one of my go-tos is How Reason Can Lead to God from Josh Rasmussen. Like, I think that just primes your mind for understanding the topics. Otherwise, there's just different books out there on different topics. Metaphysics is a really wide topic. So it's hard to like point out a specific book for this or off the top of my head. Kyle, do you have any, or Caleb, Joe?
Probably Robert Kuhn's work.
Okay.
I was gonna say How Reason Can Lead to God. So
fair enough. Joe, you got anything?
I guess I can say read everything. I mean, just read a lot of
that's a good place
books.
to start.
Yeah.
Okay, well here, Joe,
The Bible.
just to give you some, Joseph, just to help you out so you're not excluded from this. What is a good? What are good books? If once someone establishes metaphysics and theism, what would be a good book selection of books for someone if they want to get into New Testament reliability or just like resurrection or just history of Christianity that you'd recommend once they've read about theism and they're convinced of theism? Maybe that's a good question for you.
Oh yeah, I got an answer to that. First off, read the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls. You got to read all the secondary literature. But if you're talking about a scholar book, Craig S. Keener's 4-volume work on Acts, that itself is a masterpiece. People can shit on it as much as they like, but it's an amazing work. It's something that took him more than 10 years to write. So yeah, definitely read that first if you guys want to get into New Testament scholarship.
I also, big surprise, but I know shocker coming, but read the McGrew's work.
Yeah, they're good. They're good.
And Nick,
Someone said Mike Heiser, yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely.
R.I.P.
I mean, I'm a Michael Heiser simp. So, anything Michael Heiser, I highly recommend. I'm actually working on a video on pretty much just like rehashing and reframing some of his work on the Deuteronomy 32 stuff with Yahweh and El. So, yeah, I'm a huge Michael Heiser simp. I highly recommend Heiser, but that's not necessarily New Testament stuff. It's more just. I'm of the mind that Michael Heiser really does a good job of like showing how good theology is a really good apologetic as well. That's why I like Heiser's really like a lot. So, cool. We got. I don't see any more questions. You guys have anything else you want to add in before we kind of call it quits?
No, just for people. Yeah, just go back. if you have any questions about my presentation, you can just email me because I know it's kind of technical. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for your time in here. Thank you everybody for watching. Steven, if you watch this, no hate, all love. I love your hair. I love your accent, and I loved the editing that you did. So it'd be really dope if you.
And I still
Show
want to
me
get your
that.
card game for us to play together because I think that'd be really fun. Like us as the theist group, I think that'd be really fun to get your game about logical fallacies and cards. So
Oh yeah, I forgot he has that. That's pretty cool. Cool. Well, again, thank you for everybody for watching. Until next time, God bless.
Adios.